So hi, I'm Josh Korda of Dharma Punks New York, and I'm here with my good friend and esteemed colleague, Koshin of the New York Zen Center for Contemplative Care. And we're having a conversation at the behest of Buddha Dharma magazine, and we're going to be covering an array of subjects, but mostly focusing around the spiritual bypass. Now, what the heck is that? Well, the spiritual bypass is hoping that we can use spiritual practice in a way that we can escape feeling life's difficult, painful emotions and escape life's difficult, painful experiences. And many people I know from my own experience working as a teacher, mentor, doing one-on-one work over the last decade, many people come to Buddhist centers kind of hoping if they just learn the right way to meditate or be mindful that somehow sadness, loss, grief can all be sidestepped. And we've got some bad news, it can't. But I'd like to talk first with Koshin. What's your experience with the spiritual bypass, practitioners yearning for meditation and just Buddhist practice to somehow allow them not to live life on life's terms?
Well, it's kind of a big topic. So to me, one of the things I think about for myself when I began my own practice, and I had this idea of this kind of quiet, Zen, peaceful, equanimous, wonderful vision. And I realized that I thought that I could kind of like put that on myself. And it wasn't until really I began doing clinical work in the hospital where I really saw it like smacked in my face, where I was walking down hallways thinking that I was this spiritual, helpful person, very compassionate. And, it wasn't until people really wanted to be with, their anger and with their jealousy and their rage. And I realized I didn't know, in some ways, those parts of myself, and I'd used my practice in many ways to avoid that. So like maybe in the first 10 years of my practice, I spent really kind of putting that to the side. And it was not at all a sense of, there was a lack of intimacy within myself, and I realized how that created a barrier with the people that I was populating my life with, whether it's patients in the hospital, my partner, friends, and actually I wasn't really living fully. It's amazing. It was like really felt like a lot of like cold water in my face, like wow.
Right.
How about you?
Well, that's so rich, and it definitely mirrors my own experience. I started my practice when my dad became a Buddhist, and I'd been practicing for years, well, decades, when 9/11 happened. And shortly thereafter, around 2001 in October, November, I started to have a complete, for lack of a better term, a clinical depressive episode where I could no longer function. And I was kind of driven by this hope that, well, I meditate. I'm quite good at developing concentrated states, and I can also use mindfulness to open to experiences. But there was still this underlying agenda of I don't want to feel any of this. One, I was feeling a sense of complete inauthenticity in my life, a complete alienation from what I was doing for work. I was working in advertising at the time, go figure. I felt a lack of purpose, profound purpose in my life. I didn't feel I was doing anything for the greater good. And I felt like life was slipping by and I wasn't really winding up with anything to hold on to. And I sort of hoped that amidst this grief, this sense of confusion, that my practice surely should make it all go away. And what I didn't expect was that the moment I had this agenda of It's not about holding and creating a safe container. The moment I had this agenda of, no, you've got to go away, these feelings are not supposed to be here, that not only undermined the ability of these feelings to arise and pass, it made them stuck, just the resistance of wanting them to go away, but it actually added the secondary story of I'm not doing my practice well enough because I'm feeling sadness, I'm feeling grief, I'm feeling confusion, and it literally, that experience I'm so grateful for because I had to completely start all over in terms of realizing that practice is about welcoming, holding, opening to, and nurturing these feelings. So moving.
Imagine that.
Imagine that.
But I think in some ways it's so important, like my teacher always talks about, that life is the great teacher if we're willing to be taught, if we're willing to receive whatever is actually arising. And this, I know for myself, this incredible desire to control and to mediate, my experience. And, whether it's in myself or the students here at the center, and it's just so incredible how much we're so busy.
Right.
Mediating our experience, and yet the Dharma is always presenting itself so clearly saying, it's right here.
Right.
It's right here. It's what's arising in this moment, not what you prefer.
Right.
Right. Like that wonderful Zen saying of the great way is not difficult for those who have no preferences. That small teaching.
Very small teaching.
It's just one of those impossible instructions that is like a lifetime of practice. And to me, that's the joy of practice too, about really allowing ourselves to say, wow, this feeling, here we are.
Right.
Right.
Absolutely.
And pushing away nothing.
Pushing away nothing. Absolutely. One thing I've found is that a lot of people come, speaking of spiritual bypass, a lot of people come to New York Dharma Punks and to the other places I teach and to one-on-one work with me. They've had difficult relational experiences with other people. They've gone through painful childhoods with their caretakers. They've gone through painful relationship breakups, difficult interpersonal experiences across the board. And there's this hope that somehow Buddhism will be the way that they can live without having to become vulnerable or have risky, deep, empathetic connections in their lives. And we all know that we need, as the Buddha said over and over again, we need to have wise, deep spiritual connections with other people in our life if we are to be, if we are to find any peace, because human beings, we help emotionally regulate each other. We don't emotionally regulate entirely alone on the cushion. The cushion creates a safe container, but eventually what we need to do is find another person and disclose not just the pretty feelings, but the dark feelings of loneliness, despair, sadness, fear. I need to talk to you and bring that to you. You need to talk to me, bring that to me. So what is your experience with people hoping to sidestep the difficult interpersonal work of disclosing and opening to each other by hoping that they can just go to a Zen center and meditate and not have to do the interpersonal work?
Well, the reason we founded the center was really this huge gap that we saw in practice, in our own practice. That the real need to, yes, meditate, yes, study with a teacher, yes, be in a community, but also how do you learn how to be in relationship? So a lot of the work we do here is around actually caregiving and learning what does that mean to actually care for another person. Does it mean that you have to do exactly what I want you to do? many people think that caregiving or even spiritual relationships are you doing what another person wants you to do, right? What the teacher wants you to do, what the teacher wants you to think or how to be.
Right.
So to me, it's about the whole process of it's so amazing and so challenging is like really learning what does it mean to trust the moment, that it's perfect and complete, lacking nothing. It's like the incredible challenge of that and the dynamism of that. And I feel like that's what we're so curious here about. And I feel like actually that's one of the reasons why, I feel connected to you. I feel like there's like this incredible curiosity and liveliness about the practice when we're in relationship and not making it another and not realizing and practicing separation and projection.
Right.
Because often I think what happens with spiritual bypass is like that people will feel this sense of that they're right and other people are wrong.
Yeah.
And, like people who come, as we all do, with our challenges of our lives. And we can, put on the Buddhist hat and say like, well, I'm now kind of like a holy person. And all those out there in some ways have to be destroyed. All of that is not real.
Right.
All of that is wrong or not real spiritual practice. So much of that happens like what is the real Zen or what is real Theravadan practice or we can create separations in so many ways. And so to me, the idea is like just in Zen practice, we just come back to the breath. Just come back to, right?
Well, also that idea of trusting in the moment, and when you go to the old ideas of what's the, like with Winnicott, the true self versus the false self, if we're authentic, we really open to what's being felt right now. Part of becoming more authentic in life, becoming more, building those core, deep, empathetic relationships that are absolutely necessary for us to feel safe in the world and securely connected involve literally returning to the moment, what's being felt right now, and taking the risk of exploring it, just signaling it both verbally and non-verbally to each other, being able to be soft or hard or worried or anxious and owning it and disclosing it. In fact, we now know, thanks to neuroscience, that of course the brain has the left hemisphere which allows us, me and you, to connect through language, but we're also constantly, through the right hemisphere, taking each other in emotionally, seeing how securely connected we feel. And the way we securely connect is by opening the parts of ourselves that we've hidden from others out of fear that we'll be rejected. And it's only when I say, oh, I'm sad, I'm frightened, I'm lost in life, and I express that, and you, rather than tell me what to do or give me some pat answers, you empathetically mirror me that we make that bond that allows us to heal.
Right, but I think that in some ways, yes, but that's maybe, 10%, because for me, it's also how do we use that feeling, because empathy is neutral in itself. It just means I feel you.
Yeah.
But how do we work with what we do with that feeling? Like one of my favorite things to talk about is like that our torturer has to be deeply empathic. They have to really know what the other person's feeling. So it has that incredible valence of like, whoa, it could go either way. And I think what happens very often in spiritual communities is that with the bypass is that sometimes people will feel something, another practitioner will feel it from another, and then they will create separation.
Right.
So what do we do in that moment when we feel another person withdrawing or angry or really having a wonderful time? You know, like, and how do we function compassionately in those moments? So how do we, you know, use our actions by the way that we respond? And I feel that this is, you know, so much of the work that I'm interested in, and what we do here is about how do we respond? And what do we do if we're uncomfortable with that feeling that we're being empathically attuned to?
Yeah.
And we're like, I don't want to go there because I don't have, name it, ambition, jealousy, envy, the list goes on and on. But it also includes like joy, and you know, we all have different difficulties with different things, right, and different emotions. You know, actually the biggest surprise for me is that a lot of people have difficulty actually feeling joy. You know, that is alien. So to me it's like, in all of it, all the aliens are fine.
Right.
But how do we work with them and have new relationships for them as sanghas, as communities, as teachers and students, and all of us are in it together.
Right. Well, joy is certainly, any emotion, as you indicate, can create feelings of lack of security, depending on our early experience with our caretakers. For example, in my family, my parents were very secure and very rewarding for creative and for when I was happy. But when I was disappointed, that was not good, because they were both trying to assimilate and become successful. They were very kind people, but they were, you know, first-generation Americans trying to establish security in America. So if I was disappointed, that was an emotion that was not rewarded, was in fact kind of rejected and shamed. And as a result, in my adult life, it became very difficult to express disappointment in my relationships with people. When I would, when somebody would do something a little unskillful and they apologize, I just want to make it go away, because the feeling that was being activated was very, very uncomfortable. You know, I was basically informed early on that that's not a safe emotion to express. One thing I wanted to definitely, before I forget, grief. It's, for me, an important subject. In the early Buddhist suttas, the Buddha sort of teaches that to people who were grieving and really demonstrating deep sorrow, that they were making some kind of self-indulgent mistake, or they were being unskillful. In fact, in the Solace Sutta, the Buddha says, "It's not by weeping and grief that you gain peace. Bewailing one whose time is done, you fall under the sway of grief," which he says is not skillful. And to me, as Buddhism integrates itself into the West and into our practice, I think we need to have a whole new relationship with grief, because not just people like Bowlby and Elizabeth Kubler-Ross have demonstrated that grief is very much a core practice of life. It allows the emotional brain to process loss. And without grieving, if we try to use Buddhist practice as a way around grieving, and then we're not really emotionally coming to grips with not just the loss of relationships with other people and the death of loved ones, but eventually in our own death, our own experience with mortality, we will not be able to process in any meaningful emotional way the experience. Because obviously doing the chaplaincy work, what are the different relationships that you see people have with grief, how they want to turn it into a story rather than just feel it, and the desire to put a timetable on it, or, you know, just make it go away?
Grief doesn't have a timetable, right? It's waves, and it's like trying to control the ocean. And, and whether we're training physicians or training chaplains or nurses or social workers, everyone wants to kind of keep it at bay.
Right.
Right. But, as it, sometimes I think of the old stories from the Greek where, Sisyphus, didn't want death to happen. So he bound up Hades in shackles. So death would be no more.
Right.
And we know how it turned out for him. And in some ways, I feel like that's actually the image of when we try to keep our grief at bay. It's like rolling up that boulder, up a mountain, and it will keep rolling down until we really enter it.
Right.
And realize that it's just part of life.
Right.
That to grieve probably means that that relationship was meaningful. Mm-hmm. And it will never exist again in that same form.
Right.
And to me, the rituals around grief, and there are memorial rites and different things in the Zen tradition that I know most about, but to ritualize passing and to really honor, which I feel like is really missing, that there's not a real honoring of, wow, this happened. And then often what happens, in particular the people we train, like that, people are around for a little while, supporting, curious, but it's really like, what about a year later? Because grief is still happening. Our relationship with those we love continues in new forms. And so to me, I know for myself, when my grandmother died, that when there was this one practitioner who would ask me from time to time over the years, how is your relationship with her going? And it was so healing for me and so moving for it just to be kind of ordinary. Just like, oh, how's that relationship going?
Yeah.
And for me, it felt like an acknowledgement. And I feel like that's in some ways what bottles up grief and makes it more intense.
Yeah.
Was like that story of Sisyphus. It's like trying to bind it up and control it.
Right.
As opposed to, it's part of life and let's talk about it. So like kind of coming back to what you're saying about community.
Right.
And not bypassing. It's like, it's major. It's beautiful to actually have that depth of feeling.
Right.
And to me, that's what our meditation practice brings us, is that like stability to actually be with, weeping,
Right.
be with our sorrow, be with our joy. It's like, so it's the great gift of practice, is that if we don't push away anything,
Right.
jealousy, grief, sorrow, whatever it is, this.
Yeah. One experience I had, and I'm pretty sure you'll recognize it, is when I did hospice visits, I would see families literally constantly say, oh, you're not dying, at a hospice or at hospitals, really trying to avoid, always say, oh, grandma, you're looking great today, you'll outlive me, grandma, even in settings where it was patently obvious that the body was letting go. And what occurred to me is that, we all have emotion contagion. We all are very vulnerable to the emotions of others. So not only do we try to keep our own difficult emotions, whether it's fear or, as you said, envy or jealousy or anxiety, we all try to keep these states at bay, but we also try to manage other people. We don't want other people to become...
In a big way.
In a big way, because if I allow you to experience grief, then I know, due to the fact that the right hemisphere is so open to pulling in the emotional states of others, that I will start to feel it too. When we go to funerals will say things like, oh, well, at least he lived a long life, or, he's somewhere peaceful now, or we're trying to get rid of the sorrow.
Or just the reality.
The reality. Because we don't want the other person to become emotional or to experience full-on grief in front of us because we're frightened of it. Does that sound right?
Oh, I think we're so frightened, but I also feel so much for the family members and Sangha members and teachers and students, because we don't have a lot of exposure to these things in our life.
Right.
We live in a society that has relegated, old age into nursing homes, or maybe an assisted living,
right.
Or independent living.
And bodies are whisked away.
They're whisked away, and sick people are put in hospitals, dying people are put in hospice. Like, everything is so relegated away, so we don't actually have experience.
Yeah.
Like oh, you're getting older.
Right.
And how is that? Like, we don't have that experience. So I have a lot of, it's heartbreaking to see, the struggle that people have, gripping the edge of the bed, the foot of the bed, and terrified to even get close to someone.
Yeah.
Physically.
Yeah.
Because it's like so other.
Yeah.
And so to me, it's like,
if I get close to it, I'll catch it.
I'll catch it, and I might die too.
Right. If I just stay away from it, I'll never have to die.
But people really believe that. It's really goes back to the Sisyphus story. It's like, we can just bind it up, it won't happen. And to me, one of the beautiful teachings for me is from the Lotus Sutra, which is this, starts with this incredible image of the assembly, this great assembly where everything is there. There's like demons and angels and gods and fighting demons and snakes and all kinds of creatures. And everything is welcome. And imagine that, like, even for me, is like, how do I imagine that in this moment, really just welcoming the huge assembly, the great assembly, and pushing nothing away in this moment. So to me, that's when I can go and be with my grief, because that's what's there.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think what people need to realize is that which we repress or use avoidant coping strategies towards doesn't just go away. People who, for instance, have an anxiety around groups or speaking in public, if they don't work on that, then the moment they actually do have to speak in front of other people, which will happen in life, they have a nervous breakdown, a panic attack. Right. And if we avoid the recognition, the reflection, the opening to death, then what happens when it does eventually appear, then our relationship with it will be so dysfunctional, so dysphoric, so I can't be here, this is not supposed to happen, this is a mistake, this is wrong, this should not be happening to me. And of course, additionally, not just that, but the entire spiritual practice is founded upon opening to that. The Buddha, his entire journey started with seeing old age, sickness, death. In our own lives, if we don't allow ourselves to open to the grief of others, to the loss of others, to
the growth of
others, then we have no possibility of spiritual growth, really.
Yeah, I mean, I think that sometimes we even, like with any kind of change, it's also a relationship to change, right?
Yeah.
I think the Buddha referred to that, right? That there's something about change.
Yeah, a little thing.
Yeah.
Little tiny, little nugget about impermanence.
But I think that our relationship to that is very complex, right? And that there's something in us that's like, no, I don't want that to be really happening.
Right.
I like the idea of impermanence. Everything falls away, but then when it actually happens, we're like, no, and we get angry.
Right.
And resentful. What I see so often, you know, with any kind of change, and it's whether in the hospital or here at the center, like people usually are like, well, why is this happening to me?
Right.
There's this assumption that like, if I practice, then these things won't happen to me.
Right.
It's so amazing, you know, and I see that in myself too.
Right.
Like flickers of that. It's like, you know, like that feels uncomfortable.
Right.
I don't really like that. And just noticing that aversion and how, like, you know, just a lifetime of practice, you know, to me it's like the beauty of seeing my own practice as just a lifetime of practice.
Right.
That where it's never about arriving.
Right.
Right. But there's this idea of like arriving. And I think anytime we think that we've arrived somewhere, we push something else away. Process.
Well, that sounds suitably deep.
Doesn't it?
It does. I was like, wow. But certainly when you talk about hoping that if we practice, we won't have to experience loss, it reminds me of that whole human process of worrying, where I believe if I worry enough about some outcome, then it won't happen. You know, worrying is like, oh.
And that doesn't work?
It hasn't so far, but I keep trying. No. It's though that idea that if we think about it, or we pay some tie or some toll, that somehow it won't, and it can come as a real bitter surprise that no matter how much we practice, no matter how much we are diligent in our practice, we will still experience all of what the Buddha called the 5 recollections. I am of the nature to become sick, to grow old, to die. I will be separated from all that is dear to me, and all that I will stand upon are the results of my actions. So I think we've covered a lot of territory, and I'm always really just honored to be in the presence of my friend Koshin and all the wonderful work that the New York Zen Center for Contemplative Care does. If you'd like to look into any of the work we do, you can, of course, find us on Google, and my work is on New York Dharma Punks, or dharmapunksnyc.com. So with that, I'd like to thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Metta.